I'm not gonna lie to you, the fact that I recently began to play Hades again may or may not be the reason I felt inspired to make this video. That and reading all these YouTube comments about how Hades is misunderstood in our modern culture. So let's dive into it. And there's going to be spoilers for the game Hades. Okay, so this is not really Hades, and this is not really Hades either, and especially not this one. This, however, actually is Hades. And yes, of course, before people get angry and there is an uproar, this is just an interpretation of who Hades is, based on actual Greek myth. But I personally think it's the one that represents him best. He's not just some evil character twirling his mustache. He's a very hard and stern god of the underworld. And the actual game Hades, does a really good job of representing this. So why am I saying that? Why am I saying that pop culture did our grumpy god of the underworld dirty in most cases? And why do I think that the game Hades is probably one of the best portrayals of the character? Well, let's find out and dive deep into the lore. A super important thing to say as a preface is that Greek mythology and the sources and interpretations are all over the place. So the picture I paint here may not be accurate if you come across some different source or interpretation. So nothing I'm saying is final. So yeah, just so you know, this is kinda subjective, but let's get into it. Hades, Lord of the Underworld. When he and his brother Zeus and Poseidon split the world between them, he became the Lord of the Underworld, where souls of the departed came when they died. Quick side note, Hades is the god of the dead, not of death itself. That's another guy named Thanatos. He also had sisters, notably Demeter. Remember that will be important later. Hades then became the lord of the earth, the underworld, and the souls that resided there. Hades was not really portrayed as an evil god. He was more of a passive, stoic manager, ruling his realm and maintaining balance with an iron fist, requiring all to strictly follow his commands. We don't know much about his personality other than the fact that he was cold and stern. Especially, at least from what I could read from the wiki, people didn't want to give Hades too much attention since he was the god of death and all that, so we don't know much of him as a character. He would generally not stray from his house of Hades or care much about what happened on the outside world beyond his domain. There are accounts of him interacting with different characters and heroes, and I will mispronounce these, such as Odysseus, Erinyes, Heracles, Orpheus, Theseus, or Achilles. The role Hades takes in these different stories goes from giving a helping hand to punishing the heroes who ventured into his realm for one reason or another, after they failed him or just because that's how the story goes. So as I stated before, he very much seems like a natural force in the world, sometimes playing the part of an antagonist and sometimes a helping hand. So Achilles' soul said to Odysseus that he would rather be a slave than be the king of the underworld, and all the perished dead. So as far as I understand it, Hades has taken a burden upon him and is bearing it admirably. If it really sucks so much to be the king of the underworld, then you kinda have to respect the guy. Also, and this is really important to remember, he has a really cool dog named Cerberus, which has 3 heads. And that kinda gives him extra points for being a cool guy. So generally, this paints Hades in a very different light than modern depictions. Not so much an evil villain, and more just a kinda grumpy, solitary man bound by his duties. And the cool beard he has too, which is important to remember. The main objection to Hades being a good fella, or at least a good compared to the rest of the gods, is the story of Hades and Persephone. This is what people bring up as a reason that Hades may not be the greatest of guys. There are tons of interpretations of this story, so keep that in mind. This is just one way to understand it. Hades fell in love with the god Persephone and wanted to take her as his wife. Then asked Zeus, the father of Persephone, and since it was his daughter, he simply said yes to Hades and offered her up. Hades took her to the underworld and took her as his wife. Zeus did, however, not talk this through with Demeter, Persephone's mom, which got Demeter, quite understandably, really mad at the fact that her daughter had basically been kidnapped. Demeter, the god who basically controls the fertility of the earth, got quite mad and basically started to make the planet and earth into a barren wasteland. In the end, the gods convinced Hades they had to give her back to Demeter, otherwise the mortal realm would die out. Hades obliged to the quest. He, however, gave Persephone a pomegranate from Hades' home under the earth. When she either forcibly had to eat it or ate it willingly, it basically bound her to the underworld. So she could only be with Demeter around half the year, and then she had to return underground. That's basically also the explanations for the seasons, because she only could be with her mom half the year. So yeah, this story definitely paints Hades kinda like a douche. And it fully makes sense why some people point at this story as an argument to say, hey, Hades is not that great of a guy. The problem here arises because people interpret this story in a whole bunch of different ways. I'm not really citing anything academic here, just from reading things on the internet like discussions and articles, it seems like people interpret these stories in a lot of different ways, and it also seems like there are different sources on it. Some interpret it as Hades forcefully making her eat the pomegranate and bind her to the underworld. Others talk about how Persephone knew what it would entail to eat the pomegranate and wanted to be the queen of the underworld. Another point is that Zeus gave permission for Hades to be with his daughter, so strictly lawfully speaking, Hades did nothing wrong. Though again, that depends on if you look at it through the culture that made these myths, or through the ethics that we would apply today. So using this story as an argument for why Hades is kind of a bad guy seems like kind of a coin toss, in my opinion at least. The game Hades makes it pretty clear what interpretation they go with, as Hades never tried to force someone to be his wife. And he's a lot more innocent in this story than in some of the other interpretations of the story. A point I also see being brought up about Hades and how he's maybe not that bad of a guy is the fact that he's not really cheated on his wife compared to some of the other gods like Zeus, for example, as the main offender. And yeah, that is definitely a point you can make. I have kind of like done some digging on the internet though, and there are two examples where Hades maybe were unfaithful, with Lewis, an ocean nymph, or Minith, a past lover of Hades. And again, in these stories, it's kind of up to interpretation again, if he cheated or not. So maybe or maybe not. So yeah, after doing some research to answer the question, so is Hades like a good guy or... And the answer is, well, maybe, I guess, I don't know. So yeah, it's again up to interpretation. And that's also why the title of this video is called The Best of the Worst, right? So yeah, I would say there is something to the point of saying that Hades is not that bad of a guy. He is the best of the worst, so to speak. And it does a pretty alright job compared to the other ones in being a kind of decent god. But again, that depends if you choose to interpret these stories as him being a little more kind-hearted than some of the other interpretations. But no matter how you slice it, if you compare him to some of the other gods like Zeus and Poseidon, then he's leagues above those guys, even if he's the one living underground. So Hades is basically a really stoic, stern god. And yeah, he may or may not have some slip-ups, depending on how you interpret it, but all in all, he seems like a really interesting and nuanced character. And I think these are the reason people and myself, to an extent, get a little bit irritated at how Hades is portrayed in popular media, especially looking at you, Hercules, and how Zeus is just like the coolest guy ever and the coolest god in that film. And Hades is the main bad guy with freaking fire shooting up from his head and stuff like that. And that brings me back to what I said at the start. I think the game Hades is one of the best portrayals of the character. In that game, they took the interpretation where Hades didn't abduct or restrain Persephone. And if we choose to follow that interpretation, then I think it quite clearly stands to reason that this interpretation suits Hades far better than other modern interpretations of the character. Even if we take the standard interpretation of him and Persephone, he's still a far more interesting and nuanced character than what he usually gets reduced to as just an evil guy. So here we have a god that's very stern, stoic, but he's not evil by any account. Yes, he's misguided and he's not a good father in the game, but he both has negative and positive qualities to him. And that gets really overlooked in popular media. And that is what I think is so cool about him. He's nuanced and interesting, and not as one-sided as most modern depictions make him out to be. So this has been my little ramble about Hades and why he can be a really interesting character. Hope you all enjoyed it, and again, you can't deny the guy who has this dog is not a pretty neat character.